Wyoming Territory, October 1889. The wind cut hard across the plains as Brandon Odell reined in his gelding at the edge of the cottonwood grove, eyes narrowing on the figure stumbling through the brush. Blood on her dress, mud on her boots, and in her arms, two children who looked half-starved and barely conscious. He dismounted fast. "Ma'am," he called, voice firm but not sharp. "You hurt." The woman blinked up at him, dazed, lips cracked and trembling. Please. They my children." She collapsed forward just as Brandon caught her. By the time he rode back to his homestead with 3 on the saddle, her slumped in front of him, hugging her children close. Snow had started to fall. Early for the season, but Wyoming never did care for rules. He got them inside, laid her on the bed, the kids on the bearskin rug by the fire. He stoked it high, stripped off his coat, and brought water. The woman came to slowly, watching him with wary, glassy eyes. "I'm Brandon," he said, crouching beside the bed. "You're safe now. What's your name?" She swallowed.
Tessa.
"Tessa Hargrove." She reached weakly toward the children.
Kyle.
"And Katie." Brandon looked over. The boy might have been 7, the girl maybe 5. Both bone-thin, cheek sunken. "Did someone hurt you?" Brandon asked, voice low. Tessa nodded once. "My husband. He left us in Cheyenne 6 months ago. For another woman. Took the money, the wagon, everything. I tried to make do. Worked when I could. But the last family I worked for, he tried to touch me. When I fought back. He threw us out in the dark." Brandon's jaw tightened. He glanced at the kids again. "You walked all the way out here?" "4 days. I saw your chimney smoke yesterday, but I didn't have the strength to make it until now." Her voice cracked. "I thought I was going to die." "Not today," Brandon said. He stood, pulled down blankets, tucked them over her.
Rest.
"I'll feed the kids." She watched him through wet lashes as he moved into the kitchen. Brandon had never been a man with grand plans. He had a few dozen head of cattle, a good horse, and a quiet life. No wife. No children. Not because he didn't want them, but because life had never handed him anything easy, and he'd stopped expecting it to. But the way those kids clung to each other, the way Tessa had kept walking through the Wyoming cold just to keep them alive, that stirred something deep in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. He ladled out the last of the rabbit stew from the hearth pot and carried it over in tin bowls. The boy, Kyle, was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse. "Are you going to send us away?" Brandon crouched down beside him.
"No, son.
You're safe here." Kyle looked at his mother, then back at Brandon. "Are you sure? I said so, didn't I?" The boy nodded, then dug into the stew like he hadn't eaten in a week. It was well after midnight when the fire had burned low. The kids curled up on a blanket near the hearth, and Tessa sat up in the bed. Brandon was still awake, sitting in the single wooden chair near the door, sharpening his knife. He looked up when he heard her stir. "You should be sleeping," he said gently. "I wanted to thank you. You do not have to."
Ida.
Her voice was soft, but steady now. "No one's helped me in a long time." Not without wanting something in return. Brandon stood and crossed the room, but kept a respectful distance. "You do not owe me anything, Tessa." She looked up at him, eyes glinting in the firelight.
"Still."
"Thank you." He nodded once. "They can stay as long as they need."
"So can you."
"I have room." Her eyes searched his face like she was trying to find the catch. When she found none, she looked down at her lap. "I do not know how to repay you." "You already have," he said simply. That night, she slept in his bed, warm and safe. He took the chair. The next morning, snow blanketed the prairie in white. The wind had died, and the sky was clear. Tessa stood at the window, looking out. Brandon was behind her, feeding wood into the fire. The kids were still asleep. She turned to him slowly. "We should be going soon." Back to what? He asked. I do not know, but I can't stay here forever. Why not? She folded her arms. Because nothing this kind lasts. Brandon set the poker down, walked toward her, stopped just close enough to look her in the eyes.
Tessa.
Would you stay if I told you I love you? Her breath caught. I know it is fast. I know it sounds foolish. But I meant it when I said you already repaid me. I have not felt a damn thing this strong in years. I never thought someone would come walking into my land and change everything. But you did. She stared at him, heart pounding. I love you, he said again, quiet but steady. The minute I saw you hold those kids like that, the way you fought through pain just to keep them breathing. You call that foolish, I call it proof. Tessa stepped closer before she could talk herself out of it. She reached up, touched his jaw. I never thought I would hear those words again. Not from someone who meant them. I mean them. Her eyes filled. Then yes, I'll stay. Brandon leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was warm, gentle, and full of quiet promise. Behind them, a log cracked in the fire, and the snow kept falling outside. But inside, everything felt still and safe. And for the first time in a long time, Tessa believed she might be loved for real and for good. The frost held through morning, clinging to fence rails and the brittle stalks of last season's hay. Brandon rolled his sleeves as he stepped into the barn, breath misting in the cold. The animals needed feed, and the water trough had iced over. He cracked it with a mallet, then hauled a bucket from the well. When he returned, Tessa stood just outside the cabin, wrapped in a wool shawl he hadn't seen in years. It hung loosely around her shoulders, too big, but she didn't seem to mind. Her eyes were fixed on the sky, where a pair of crows wheeled above the ridge. You're up early, he said. I heard the rooster, she answered without turning. I thought I should try to help. He set the bucket down. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not. I just don't like sitting still. She moved toward the barn, careful not to wake the children who still slept behind the cabin shutters. Brandon handed her a pitchfork, and without a word, they began forking hay into the stalls. The horses shifted and snorted, steam rising from their flanks. The rhythm of their work settled into quiet understanding, no rush, no instruction, just two people making sense of a shared space. Tessa paused, leaning her arms on the stall door. How long have you lived here? 5 years. Alone that whole time? He nodded. Before that, I wrangled cattle for a man out near Rollins. Saved what I could. When this land came up, I took it. You built the house? With my own hands and a few calluses. She smiled faintly, brushing a lock of dark hair from her cheek. It's solid. You did good work. He didn't answer right away. Her praise felt like something rare, hard-earned. He checked the harness on the mare, then said, You ever work land before? Not like this. My father was a blacksmith. I helped him shoe horses and pour molds. My mother kept a vegetable patch, but I was never much good at weeding. He chuckled low in his throat. I've got a patch come spring. It's mostly weeds anyway. Tessa watched him for a long moment, her eyes not guarded like before, but curious. Do you mean what you said last night? He didn't stop working.
Ida.
You don't even know me. I know enough. She stepped back, fingers tightening around the shawl. I'm not a girl with a clean slate. I've made bad choices. Stayed too long where I shouldn't. I'm not proud of it. Neither am I, he said, turning. I've done things I don't talk about. But I know what it means to carry something heavy and keep walking. Her voice dropped. I've never had a man see me and not expect something in return. You've never met the right man. They stood in silence as the horses settled. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving only the sound of melting ice dripping from the eaves. Back in the cabin, the children had stirred. Katie padded barefoot across the floor, her braid uneven, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Tessa knelt and wrapped her in the shawl. "Are you hungry?" Katie nodded. Brandon pulled down a sack of cornmeal from the shelf and poured it into the pot. "I'll make mush. There's honey left." Kyle sat up near the hearth, blinking at the light. "Can we stay here?" Tessa looked to Brandon, uncertain. He met Kyle's gaze. "That's not up to me alone anymore. But I hope so." The boy didn't answer, but he moved closer to the fire and curled up again, more at ease than before. Later, when the sun had risen high enough to start melting the snow from the cabin roof, Brandon hitched the sled to the mare. Tessa stood on the porch, Katie beside her, watching. "I need to ride into town," he said. "Supplies are low. I'll be back before dusk." She hesitated. "Do you want me to come?"
No.
"Stay warm.
Rest.
I'll bring back flour, salt, and whatever else I can carry." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded dollar. "If the stove acts up, use the extra wood behind the barn. Don't let the fire die." Tessa took the bill, brow furrowed. "You trust me with this?" "I trust you with more than that." Then he stepped into the saddle and rode off toward the narrow trail that wound into the hills, his silhouette shrinking into the pale light. Inside, Tessa swept the floor and boiled water for laundry. The children helped her scrub their clothes outside, dipping them in the steaming pot, wringing them out with stiff fingers. When they came back in, cheeks red, she set them near the fire and handed them cups of warm milk. That afternoon, she opened the chest at the foot of the bed and found spare shirts, a battered Bible, and a hand-carved wooden box. She didn't open the box, just ran her fingers over the grain. When Brandon returned, the sky had turned gold behind the hills. His saddlebags were full, and he carried a bolt of muslin in one hand. "What's that?" she asked as he stepped onto the porch. "Thought you might want to make something for the girl," he said. "She's outgrown what she's got." Tessa took it, her breath catching. "You didn't have to." "I know." She looked up at him, then stepped forward. "I'll make her a dress. And something for Kyle, if there's enough." When their hands touched over the fabric, neither of them pulled back. Brandon's fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. "I've never had a home I could trust," she said. "Then let's make this one." And in that moment, with the wind settled and the fire glowing low inside, it felt possible. Not easy, not perfect, but real, and enough. The snow thawed slow that week, turning the yard to mud and the creek behind the house into a restless trickle. Tessa hung wet linens on the line, hands reddened from the cold. The sky stretched wide and pale above her, clouds thin as gauze. From the barn came the sound of Brandon's splitting cedar, steady and sure. Kyle and Katie sat on the porch steps, carving sticks with blunt knives Brandon had dulled for them. They barely spoke, content to be near each other, their shoulders brushing now and then. When Tessa glanced back at them, her chest ached with something close to peace. Brandon joined her not long after, wiping his palms on the thighs of his trousers. "We'll need to muck the stalls before the freeze hits again," he said. Tessa nodded, clothespin between her teeth. "I'll help." He watched her hands for a moment. "You ever sew for money?" Her brows lifted. "Why?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "There's a merchant over in Elk Hollow, older man, no family. Told me he's looking for someone who can mend and stitch decent. Pays in credit at his shop." She took the paper from him, eyes scanning the note. "How far is Elk Hollow?" 2 hours by wagon. "I'd take you." She folded the paper carefully. "You think I should?" He shrugged. "I think you deserve to feel useful." She tucked the note in her apron. "And you'd watch the children? They'd be fine here. Katie likes the chickens. Kyle's taken to the kindling hatchet." Her mouth curved, faint but warm. "You pay close attention." "I always have." As the sun dipped low behind the cottonwoods, they worked side by side in the barn. The animals shifted calmly around them, and the air smelled of hay and earth. Tessa moved with a quiet confidence, sleeves rolled high, apron dusted with straw. Brandon watched her loosen a bridle with practiced fingers. "You've changed," he said. She glanced over. "How do you mean?" "You stand easier. Like you belong here." Tessa brushed hair from her brow with the back of her wrist. "I've never had a place where I felt that." "You do now." He said it plain, without weight, as though it had always been true. She didn't answer, but her breath caught, and she turned back to the mare, gentling its flank. That night, after the children were tucked in and the last light faded from the porch, Brandon brought her a small cedar box from the mantel. "I made this before you came," he said. "Didn't know what for. Just kept my hands busy." She opened it slowly. Inside lay a pair of hand-carved hair combs, polished smooth, set with bits of turquoise. She ran her thumb along the edge. "They're beautiful. I thought maybe they'd suit you." Tessa looked up at him, eyes steady now. "Why me?" He took a breath. "Because I've met women who are pretty, and I've met women who were strong. But I've never met someone who held both in their hands like a fire."
Her voice was low.
"What if I burn you? I'd rather be seared than cold the rest of my days." She set the box down and stepped toward him, the hem of her dress brushing the floor. "I'm frightened, Brandon." "So am I." She reached for him, not rushed, not unsure, and he met her with the kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything, only gave. When they parted, she kept her forehead against his. "I want to stay," she whispered, "but not just in your home." He understood. "Then stay in my life." Outside, wind stirred the trees again, but inside, everything held. And in the quiet that followed, neither of them moved away. The iron kettle hissed low on the stove as morning light crept through the window panes, soft and yellow. Tessa sat at the table with a thimble on her finger, needle moving in small, careful stitches through a length of muslin. Katie lay on a quilt nearby, humming to herself as she arranged a row of river stones by size. Kyle was out back with Brandon, hauling wood in a sled made from old fence boards and rope. "Is it for church?" Katie asked, pointing at the dress beginning to take shape across Tessa's lap. "No, sweet girl. Just something nice to wear when the weather turns warm." Katie touched the fabric. "It's soft." "It is," Tessa said, threading a new length of cotton. "Mr. Odell picked it special."
Katie looked up then.
"Is he going to be our pa?" Tessa's hand paused mid-stitch. She looked at her daughter, who was watching her with quiet expectation. "I don't know," she said after a long moment. "But he's kind. That matters more than most things." The door opened before Katie could answer, and cold air swept in as Brandon stepped inside, boots caked in half-frozen mud. He carried a small, burlap-wrapped parcel in one hand and a folded slip of paper in the other. "Letter came in from Elk Hollow," he said. "Merchant says he's got work ready, if you're still of a mind for it." Tessa rose, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'd like to go tomorrow, if that works for you." He nodded, setting the parcel on the table. "Found some dried apples while I was there. Thought the kids might like a treat." Katie rushed over, lifting the flap with both hands. "Mama, look." Tessa smiled, her fingers brushing Brandon's as she reached for the note. "You didn't have to." "I know." She read the letter, brow furrowed in concentration. When she finished, she folded it neatly and set it aside. "He's offering trade credit in bolts of fabric and thread. That'll go a long way." Brandon leaned against the doorframe. "Man said his wife passed 3 winters back. He's been doing everything himself since." Tessa returned to her chair and picked up the needle again. "I'll meet him, but I won't take charity. That's not what he's offering." "I know." Brandon didn't stay long inside. He stepped back out to the yard where Kyle was stacking kindling near the porch. The boy looked up as Brandon approached. "Think we can set that rabbit snare by the creek again?" Kyle asked, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. If you cut the twine and bring the bait, I'll show you where the trail's clearest. They worked in quiet, the boy watching every knot, every notch Brandon carved in the branch. The sun had passed its peak by the time they returned, the boy's cheeks red from the cold, his arms full of dry pine. That evening, after the children were asleep and the fire burned low, Tessa stood at the wash basin, wringing out a damp cloth. Brandon sat nearby, oiling the hinges on the rifle he kept by the mantel. She asked if you be there, Pa, Tessa said, not turning. He looked up, but didn't speak right away. The soft scrape of cloth and the click of metal filled the space between them. I'd be proud to, he said finally. If you wanted that. Tessa dried her hands and crossed to where he sat. She didn't sit beside him, only stood close enough that he could feel her presence as something steady. I've spent most of my life waiting for the other shoe to fall, she said. But this place.
You.
I don't feel like I'm waiting anymore. He set the rifle aside, rising so they stood at eye level. I never planned on a family. I figured it wasn't meant for me. But now I can't picture this place quiet again. I don't want to leave, she said. Not ever. He reached for her hand, fingers rough and warm. Then don't. She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest. His arms came around her, not as promise, not as possession, but as shelter. Outside, wind stirred the eaves. Inside, the silence was full. They stood like that a long while, until the fire settled to embers and the lamp guttered low. When they pulled apart, Tessa looked up at him, her voice quiet. If I take that job, I'd like to save for a loom. Something to make proper cloth. You'll have what you need, he said. We'll build it together if we have to. She smiled, then, not the cautious kind, but the kind that came from deep roots and steady ground. And in the stillness that followed, there was nothing left unspoken. The wagon wheels creaked over frozen earth as Brandon guided the team along the narrow trail east of the ridge. Tessa sat beside him, gloved hands folded in her lap, eyes on the pale horizon. Kyle and Katie were with the McKenna family for the day, warm and fed, with Mrs. McKenna promising to keep them busy with bread dough and storybooks. The wagon bed held only a few parcels of cloth and Tessa's sewing basket, but the weight between them was something else entirely quiet, full of what they hadn't yet said in the soft hours between chores and firelight. You sure you're warm enough? Brandon asked, glancing sideways. Tessa adjusted her shawl. I'm fine. Just thinking. He gave her space to do that, guiding the horses around a patch of slush where the creek had spilled over. When they reached the rise that overlooked Elk Hollow, the small town lay quiet beneath a haze of wood smoke. The mercantile stood nearest the road, its sign faded but straight. Tessa exhaled slowly. It's strange walking into something new without fear. Brandon didn't speak right away. Then, you're not walking alone. She turned toward him, eyes steady. I know that now. Inside the store, the merchant, a slight man with a limp and the smell of pipe tobacco in his coat, showed her into the back room. Brandon waited up front, leaning against the counter as the old man handed him a cup of chicory brew. She's sharp, the merchant said under his breath. Knows her seams. Brandon nodded. She's got more grit than most men I've met. The merchant looked at him a beat longer, then gave a short nod.
Well,
she'll be useful here. It was near dusk when they returned. The wind had picked up, whispering through the dry grass. Tessa held a sheet of paper in one hand, a tally of thread, needles, and a promise for more muslin next month. I could do more, she said as they turned up the lane toward the cabin. Curtains. Linens. Maybe even quilts. Brandon looked over at her, eyes warm. Then we'll clear space in the loft. Make it yours. She smiled, not the cautious kind she'd worn when they first met, but one that reached her eyes. I'd like that. The children were asleep when they returned, curled beneath quilts with flour on their cheeks and the scent of cinnamon clinging to their hair. Brandon built the fire higher while Tessa checked the hearth, adjusting the kettle for warmth. Afterward, she joined him on the porch, where the stars were just beginning to burn through the dark. "I never thought I'd start over," she said softly. "You didn't," Brandon answered. "You built forward." She looked over at him, her voice low. "I never asked what happened before you came here?" He didn't flinch. "Wasn't much to tell. My folks passed before I was full grown. I drifted a while, took jobs that kept my hands busy. But there was nothing that made me want to stay until this place." "Until us," she said. He met her gaze. "Yes." They stood in silence as the wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine across the open plain. Then Tessa reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his. "I want to marry you." He turned toward her, stunned still for a breath. "You're sure?" "I've never been sure of anything." Brandon didn't answer. He just pulled her close, wrapped her in his arms like she'd always belonged there. They married on a clear morning 2 weeks later. The McKennas stood as witnesses. Katie wore the muslin dress Tessa had sewn, and Kyle handed Brandon the ring they'd carved from a deer bone and polished smooth. There was no preacher, only words spoken plain and true beneath the cottonwoods, with the sun rising over the ridge behind them. That night, they sat by the hearth, the children asleep, the fire steady. Tessa leaned her head on Brandon's shoulder, and he rested his hand over hers, their fingers twined. "I used to think peace was something quiet," she said. Brandon looked down at her. "And now? Now I think it's something you build. Every day." He kissed her then, slow and sure, the kind of kiss that carried no urgency, only the certainty that they had time. And they did. They planted a garden that spring, Tessa's first, that took root deep and true. She stitched curtains for the cabin and took commissions for dresses from townsfolk as far as Laramie. Brandon fenced new pasture, and Kyle helped lay every post. Katie learned to read from a worn primer the McKennas gave them, and she read aloud by lamplight until her voice went soft with sleep. The days passed, and the seasons turned. There were hardships, illness, drought, a mare that died birthing, but they faced each one steady, side by side. Tessa never left again. Brandon never looked back. And every morning, as the sun warmed the plains and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, they built a life that held strong. Not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs.